Okay, great. So hello, good morning, and welcome everybody. My name is Derek O'Halloran. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. I'm the head of digital economy at the World Economic Forum, and I'm delighted to have this conversation, this opportunity to talk about a topic that over the last 2 years, I think through the pandemic, has really come into much sharper focus for a broad range of people across pretty much every country and every walk of life. And that is the challenge of ensuring universal digital inclusion. I think through the pandemic, many of us realized how much we relied on digital and how much we could rely on digital in order to fulfill so many different areas of our lives. We were able to continue working. Many small businesses were able to stay in business. We were able to keep educating children. Really, we relied on it for pretty much every aspect of our lives. However, this is not true for everybody. In fact, today, still, 2.9 billion people, that's over 1/3 of the world's population, do not enjoy the benefits that we all take for granted with the internet. There has been some good news over the last 2 years. According to the latest information, the latest data from the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, the 800 million people have joined the internet over the last 2 years. And that's one of the biggest jumps we've seen in over a decade. So really, really great advancement, great news. However, still so much to be done. 2.9 billion people, over 1/3 of the world's population, that really do not have today any opportunity to participate meaningfully in this increasingly digital society and economy that we are building now at the beginning of this 21st century. This really is many see this issue as fundamental to so many of our other goals. Many have called this the SDG 18, or should be SDG 18, or maybe SDG 0, because it is one which would enable so many of the other goals that we want to try to achieve for an inclusive and sustainable economy and society. In January of 2021, the World Economic Forum supported a committed group of organizations to launch a coalition designed to tackle this challenge. It was called the Edison Alliance and spearheaded under the leadership of Hans Vestberg, the Chief Executive Officer of Verizon. And if we look at what is the nature of this challenge, why is it that these 2.9 billion people are not connected? One of the first things we must understand is that 95% of these people actually live within range of 3G connectivity or better. 95%. So the challenge is not just one of infrastructure. Clearly, we need to work on the infrastructure for the 5%, but it's not just a challenge of infrastructure. So what are the gaps? The key gaps are the availability of services that are affordable and meaningful for people to be able to use. And addressing that challenge requires a cross-industry and private-public approach, a multi-stakeholder approach, so that we can build the partnerships to co-develop the solutions in order to bring these services to individuals around the world. The Alliance decided, rather than try and boil the ocean, to focus first on 3 critical areas where people would get the greatest benefit from digital connectivity. That is, namely, the 3 areas being digitally enabled services across financial inclusion, healthcare, and education. This is why the Alliance is comprised of 46 leaders across all of those sectors, as well as telecommunications, technology companies, investors, governments, and international organizations. I'm very, very happy to be joined today by 3 of the members, 3 of the leaders from the Edison Alliance to talk a little bit more about the work that has been done to date and some of the work that we are launching today. One of the key pieces that we all said at the outset was that we wanted to make sure that we were very much focused on outcomes. And one of the first things we said is that we would set ourselves ambitious targets and hold ourselves accountable to those targets. So in September of 2021, last September, we launched the 1 Billion Lives Challenge, which is an effort to bring digitally enabled services across healthcare, education and financial services to improve 1 billion lives by 2025. We're going to hear more about that and the progress we've made against that in just a moment, as well as two new areas, two new pillars that will drive the collaboration and the work going forward today. So to help walk through some of these elements, I'm joined by Rima Qureshi, the Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President at Verizon, and Deputy to Hans Vestberg, the Chair of Edison Alliance. Achim Steiner, the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and our dear friend, Minister Paula Ingabire, the Minister for ICT and Innovation for Rwanda. Rima, perhaps I'll start with you. Could you tell us a little bit more, what is the 1 Billion Lives Challenge, and how is it going? What progress is being made so far?
Thank you, Derek, and very important initiative. So the 1 Billion Lives Challenge is really to look at how we can create commercially viable solutions that impact and improve 1 billion lives globally, with a focus on helping women. And as you mentioned, we started in January 2021. We thought at the time that we were coming out of the pandemic, and we were going to be focused on the areas that were most important, that we felt that came to light during the pandemic. How do you get access to telemedicine? How do you have access to education remotely? And how do you have access for everyone for financial services? So that's why we focused on those focus areas. Our objective when we started the Alliance was to ensure that we had a small but impactful group of champions, as we call them. We started with 22 champions, and we have now more than doubled to 46 champions. As Derek mentioned, we wanted to articulate exactly what was the purpose of the Edison Alliance. That's why we gave ourselves a target of 1 billion. In some respects, you could say it's a lot. In other respects, you could say it's not enough. But we want to make sure that when we say a billion, that we are able to measure and quantify that there are actually a billion people that have somehow been helped with the work that we are doing. We have, since the launch of that 1 billion challenge, doubled the number of commitments that we have. So more than half of all of our 46 champions have made a commitment. And we will be announcing in September of this year where we are towards our overall target of reaching that 1 billion. And one thing that we are very much focused on is each one of the champions that makes a commitment are also responsible for reporting, and we are focusing on ensuring that that reporting is taking us to that 1 billion challenge, and removing wherever there may be overlap. So we are definitely on our way, very much focused, and we would love to go beyond the 1 billion if we can, but we'll start by 1 billion and then we'll go from there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, clearly the ultimate goal for all of us is that we achieve universal participation, affordable participation in the digital economy. So this is a contribution from a group. Can you describe a little bit what does it mean to make a commitment for an organization?
What it means to make a commitment is to focus specifically maybe in the area that you are working. So it could be geographically, you are going to be focusing on helping, for example, if you're going to do something with healthcare and you are in the healthcare space. So that might be you are going to address healthcare services for X number of million people in a particular geography. That could be an example of a commitment. It really depends on the type of company, the type of business that you are in, and where you believe you can affect that change. In general, most of our champions are looking at making commitments multi-year, and what we try to do is to track that progress specifically from when the Edison Alliance was launched. So we will not go back in time. We will only look at the commitments that have been made since January 2021 that are applicable in the areas that we are working on. And I think one of the key reasons why we believe the World Economic Forum are the right conveners for this is we are all here and we are all represented, public, private, government, NGOs, we are all here, and our objective is to make those links, is to create that enablement, because we all have a role to play. It's really how you bring people together, how you create examples of how it's been done elsewhere, and how you can use those examples towards using similar principles in another geography or for a different field. That's, I think, what we will hear a little bit more about. So that is our objective. And we want to be very concrete. We don't want to put high-level targets that aspirationally we may not reach, or it may take a longer period of time. So that's why we are limited in time, really focused on execution, and really focused on being able to demonstrate that we have actually improved lives.
Great, thank you. Akeem, maybe I'll turn to you. And by the way, we'll have one round here, and then I will open up for questions from the audience, so we can have a little bit of a discussion for the second half. But Akeem, let me turn to you, if I may. So Rima mentioned there about some of the ongoing work that is taking place within organizations, both in the private sector, also in governments. We've seen, in the process of those 800 million being added in over the last couple of years, there's a tremendous amount of innovation that is taking place, both within the private sector and the public sector, in order to enable people. But it feels very scattered. There's an awful lot of great insight and resources available out there. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Digital Inclusion Navigator, which you've helped to co-develop along with BCG, and what its purpose is and how it might be helpful for people?
Sure, and good morning to all. I mean, just following up from where Rima was speaking, I mean, all of us who, in a sense, committed to working through this partnership, the Edison Alliance, obviously had to look for very practical and very direct ways of helping to accelerate what we observed during the pandemic, what we had, in the years leading up to the pandemic already begun to recognize, namely that digitalization, digital ecosystems were going to grow exponentially. And another way of describing, availability, accessibility, affordability is this term inclusive. So much of, as you have described, what is happening in the world right now is an extraordinary amount of experimentation, innovation, introduction of new regulatory frameworks. And so in our discussions, we felt that, first of all, deliberate design for inclusion is not always necessarily an objective that is explicitly upfront. And yet we, very much require both industry, technology developers, but also governments, investors, to make it an explicit goal, because otherwise digitalization could create new and amplify inequalities. So what's the shortcut to that? Well, the idea was, and this is where the WEF and BCG and UNDP essentially came together, is to simply create a platform, this Digital Inclusion Navigator, where in the kind of one-stop shop you can take a look at what is actually being designed, where have the success stories emerged, and particularly to also recognize, Paula will, I'm sure, speak to that in a moment, when you have a government that has a deliberate policy, how does it actually implement that? What are the regulatory frameworks, the reforms? What are the incentives, and how do providers, how do the private sector, how do consumers respond? So today we are actually, publicly launching Digital Inclusion Navigator. You will find it on the Edison Alliance website. If you go to Edison Alliance WEF, you can find the link there. And it is really, a constantly growing body of essentially demonstrated success stories, either in policy making, in design, in applications, or in a very deliberate way of giving expression to these notions of availability, accessibility, affordability. And I think hopefully will contribute to our ability to really, make lives different for 1 billion people by working together. It can just be a shortcut, it can inspire others to follow, but it's also to celebrate very smart thinking that is happening across the world. And unfortunately, it is a very diverse world, it's very dispersed, and our hope was that this accelerator would, in a sense, be a very convenient way to use.
Great, excellent. So, yeah, it definitely seems like there is no one-size-fits-all. A lot of the easy wins have been gained, but being able to rapidly scale successes from innovations in different places is something we hope to achieve there. Excellent. Paula, perhaps I'll turn to you then for a third pillar a third leg to the stool here, if you will. So Rima spoke about some of the global collaboration that has that has emerged over the past 14 months through the convening of the champions. But a lot of the innovation that Akim is talking about happens, of course, in countries, and that's where the progress, that's where the work is really done. So today we're also launching the first wave of lighthouse countries. Could you share perhaps a little what are the lighthouse countries, and what do we hope to achieve, and tell us perhaps a little around the first ones we're launching today.
Thanks, Derek. Good morning, everyone. And perhaps before I talk about the countries, maybe I'll also piggyback on what both Rima and Akim shared, and true to the design of the Edison Alliance, being a public-private partnership, it also means that governments, are also included in this. And so the idea of the Lighthouse network of countries was really around finding those like-minded countries, those countries that have already, and most countries do have their digital inclusion agenda, but it's really how many of those, to Akim's point, have already put in place the policies, the regulations that are willing to test and eager to test some of these new partnerships and new projects so that they can creatively close on the gaps that they have. Being able to, willing to share information, but most importantly, because we're talking about a public-private partnership, also willing to put some skin in the game, because when you look at the extent of the challenges that we face and the sheer amount of resources required to really close on the gaps, you can't depend only on government financing or private sector financing, so it has to be a mix of these different partners bringing together both the technical resources, the financial resources to really, and the ideas, what Kim was saying, to really close on these gaps. And so we have a set of criteria that has been put out, and essentially what we also do is to encourage countries to express interest, because we need them to show willingness to want to be part of this, not just be a part of the Edison Alliance, but also part of really closing on the digital inclusion gaps that they have within their jurisdictions. And secondly, being able to share what the best practices have been, what hasn't worked also, because sometimes someone else may want to replicate what you have done and failed, but I think that's the whole idea of the digital inclusion navigator, to be able to say we've done 10 things, 3 of them worked, 7 didn't work. And so that helps for the other countries that want to implement similar initiatives to really not burn the same circuits through the process. And so today we will be announcing the first wave, like you mentioned, Derek, of lighthouse countries, Bangladesh, Bahrain, and Rwanda. And starting with Bangladesh, both Bangladesh and Bahrain are focused on education. Derek did mention the 3 focus areas: education, financial services, and healthcare. So for the 2, Bangladesh and Bahrain, they're focused on digital skilling, digital literacy, edtech solutions for students. Bangladesh specifically with a focus on women and girls in taking on STEM careers, and Bahrain with a focus on teachers. And the beauty about all of this is that all of us, and the pandemic, if there's one sector that has been largely disrupted, is the education sector. So being able to have multiple countries that could be doing the same thing around hybrid learning, around embracing digital technologies to improve on the quality of education, I think will allow for those learnings to be shared across the board. Third is Rwanda. And we're focused on cashless, driving financial inclusion through digital payments. And our target, and the pandemic again has been a good eye-opening experience. The very first 4 months of going through the pandemic, we had 10-fold digital payments transactions happening. So we saw a clear shift from heavily cash-based ways of transacting to digital financial payments, but largely through the mobile phone. And so that's also a best practice that can be shared. What triggered that? Was it the lowering of transaction fees? How do you sustain that going forward? And so these are some of the things that we look forward to sharing. The other one that we'll be focused on is digital skilling for our citizens, where we have a target over the next 2 years to at least skill 5 million citizens by 2024. And that's a target that is really, again, going to require a lot of partnerships across the board to be able to close the gap. So going forward, even as we announce this first wave of lighthouse countries, we have a long list of many other countries that are joining the network that we will be announcing progressively. But again, to Rima's point, we need to see impact, and impact that is happening immediately, so that we can quickly understand what needs to change, but how do we close on the gaps as soon as possible.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think it's we all always watch Rwanda with admiration for the willingness to innovate and keep learning and learn, as you say, try 10 things, 3 of them work, take those, try the next 10 things. So I think it's been great to see that that has been driven forward over the last decade, and thank you for all of your work there. I will open up to the audience here for any questions that people may have. I see in the room some partners that are already actively involved, as well as maybe some new folk who are hearing and learning about some of this for the first time. But maybe just before we go there, I'd like to maybe just come back a little bit on kind of the motivations. So Rima, maybe start with yourself. So Verizon is a US-based operator. So I mean, I mean, isn't this a problem everywhere else? Why do you guys care?
He says that as if it's a bad thing. But, the motivation. Okay, so let's start with, first of all, this isn't a problem in Africa or in Asia. This is a problem globally. We have as many people or similar issues in the US as we have in other geographies. We have people who have access the way that we take for granted and what we needed to survive during the pandemic, and we have people literally sitting outside of a Starbucks or a public library because that's the only place they can get Wi-Fi connection. So this is a problem that we need to fix within the US as much as we need to fix it elsewhere. And Verizon is really committed to this. We have already spent over $3 billion on initiatives for digital inclusion. During the pandemic, we were very much focused on what we could do through the Verizon Foundation on the education side and Verizon Innovative Learning, which we have been working on for a very long time, but with a greater focus to help those during the pandemic to ensure that they could study remotely. Through the Verizon Innovative Learning Program, we've helped 1.8 million children, and we are continuing to look at how we can help others through STEM education in other areas. So it is a commitment. It is all of our responsibilities, and we all have something to contribute. So what we believe that we can contribute is not only the fact that we are in the US, but the fact that we have a belief that we can help convene and help solve the problems that we have to solve ourselves in our geography, but we can help do that with others. One of the things that we talked about that Achim mentioned, there are 3 aspects. It's the usability, it's the accessibility, and it's the affordability. A lot of the people that need to be involved from an affordability perspective are people that we have to work with in our day job. And we can use that as our way of trying to bring those people together to solve these problems. So there is the benefit of the ecosystem that we are part of to help solve these problems for ourselves as well as globally. And also because we believe it is the right thing to do.
And maybe I'll just ask Achim the same question. UNDP, perhaps digital technologies maybe not be the first thing that people would think about if they think about UNDP traditionally. Again, maybe the same question to yourself. I hope I'm not getting myself into trouble here.
What can I say? How often people get things wrong in life, isn't it? No, actually, I'm in the room here also with my colleague Doreen from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. I think, in all fairness, there are some who saw the advent of that digital universe already years ago, and they were part of enabling it to happen. I think what really began to make a development program of the United Nations, whose objective ultimately is about human development and how development can be inclusive and sustainable, was really the realization of quite how deep and how far digitalization was rapidly permeating every aspect of development in every part of the world. And so in the 2019 UNDP Human Development Report, which is sort of the annual report about where is development taking us, what is the frontier of thinking, two things, and it was the theme then was inequality. We were basically trying to unpack and understand how inequality is essentially either tackled and therefore enabling societies to advance, or indeed becoming a more pronounced problem, polarizing societies and holding it back. And the two variables that emerged there as really the ones over the next 10 to 20 years were, interesting enough, digitalization and climate change, both carrying within themselves the greatest accelerator in terms of addressing inequality, or, if not acted on appropriately, amplifying inequality. And that is the point at which I, with my leadership team, took the decision to essentially take UNDP into a digital literacy exercise to first of all understand what is it that development decision-making can influence, and what do we learn from countries that have already embarked on that pathway, successfully, unsuccessfully. But then really also understanding that our greatest contribution would be to help countries build a digital ecosystem. Because it's not just about fiber optic, it's not just about the number of people who have access, it's how do you work with the education sector so school leavers are actually able to enter a digital economy and find a place in there. How do you work with the financial system so the startup world, the enterprises that are least likely to even be looked at by a bank traditionally would actually become the front line of where small scale investments, loans, financing would become available. And how could government ensure that, along so many different trajectories, rural, urban, men and women, older people, younger people, these are all inequality lines that you can address with deliberate policy, deliberate investments. And this is why today, we have an entire team in UNDP that is working with every other team in our country offices on essentially bringing that digitalization lens to achieving development outcomes. And I think in that sense, the same logic. First of all, not to do it would be foolish, given what is happening. Secondly, it's actually an enormous opportunity.
Thank you. Well, now I am much better informed. Thank you. But two of the areas that you mentioned there are really, I think, important themes that have come through all of our work. I think one being that point around, even though we've had all of the great addition in terms of numbers to the internet, in fact, the more people that are connected and the more services become digital, it exacerbates the divide for those that are not connected. Yeah. And then second, the point around it being digital availability or adoption in one part of a community or ecosystem being an amplifier or a catalyst that then has a lot of second order, third order effects for businesses and communities. So I have a different question for you, Paula, because I know the motivation question is a little different. As the minister, it's kind of your job. So I have a different question for you, but let's go to the room first. Barry, please go ahead. So we'll just take the microphone there.
Hi, Barry French from Inmarsat. And first of all, congratulations on the great Edison work. And we were pleased to announce our commitments, I guess, 2 weeks ago. And I love the discipline and the focus on execution, because that's really great. I have what may be a slightly controversial question to ask, and Derek's already gotten himself in trouble, so I'm going to now get myself in trouble as well. I think we all look at this connectivity and say there's a social good here, which is true, and I don't doubt it for a second. In 99.9999 whatever cases, it's a good. But there are also times when all this connectivity in the wrong hands can be used the wrong way. And, I experienced it when I was with Nokia, and we had some issues in Iran where, telecom equipment was used to target dissidents and activists and ended up doing bad things. And I guess I'd just ask all of you, or whoever wants to take it, is how do you think about this issue when you bring on all these new people in connectivity? How do you think about that to ensure that what we do is a good for human rights and is not used to oppress human rights? Great. So how do we ensure we're not being too techno-optimist here and we're having a balance? Who wants to take a...
I'm happy to just give a quick response, because there is a very, very obvious response to that, and that is if you don't pay attention to it, you will exactly enable, as with any technology, those who want to manipulate it or to use it either to their own financial advantage at the expense of others, or indeed much deeper fundamental human rights issues. And it's very interesting when the Secretary General invited a group of leaders to advise him on how to look at digital cooperation in the future, there was a very poignant sentence in there, and I think it speaks exactly to what you're alluding to, which is there is a strange assumption almost with the advent of digital and you know, all that has come with it, that you know, almost 75 years of developing fundamental human rights, protection of data, citizens' rights, and so on, in an analog world, ceases to somehow be relevant in the digital world, which is a very dangerous assumption. Remember, the less restrictions, states should not interfere in the internet and so on. No, I mean, you know, citizens today are affected in their fundamental exercise of their rights, but actually also in the protection of their rights and protection as citizens. And I think we are struggling to keep up with where this is. The other dimension is cybercrime. I mean, we are today in an era where cyber warfare becomes the next form of military combat, so to speak, but in a digital sense. So again, I think we are extremely concerned in the United Nations and are looking with a great deal of attention to where is the scope to create an international framework here that, just like we have for other forms of conflict, strange as it sounds, I mean, we have to find rules for war. It's the sad tragedy of human condition. But I think that sphere that you're alluding to is absolutely part of that, and probably becoming the greatest single new threat for which there is very little right now to deal with. I'll stop here.
So maybe just to add on that, I think just like anything, there's always the benefits and risks that come with it. I like to use the example of driving. While, you know, cars were put to ease mobility, but if not used well, it results into death, right? So even when we're talking about the digital space, it's the same. And that's partly why in many cases, even as governments, you have regulations to start with, because it's meant to look at what could be the worst case scenario of what was intended to be a good thing, not actually resulting into a good thing. There's also the unintended consequences that sometimes we're not very much aware of from the onset when we're designing some of these initiatives. But what you'll typically see across the board and largely across government is that there's also an effort to sensitize, create awareness, because you also know that even when you provide this, you know, public good in the hands of the people, it may not necessarily be used for the right things all the time. And so how do you create that awareness? How do you sensitize? But also how do you put in place the checks and balances that are required to safeguard and protect those that are using it? I want to give a practical example. I remember when we were putting in a lot of effort to drive digital financial inclusion, we saw a lot of fraud coming with that. While you have more and more people that have easy access to financial services, you still had a bunch of people who were using the same tools to con citizens. And so again, and I think this is the beauty about the digital landscape, is that changes are constant. So you're constantly evolving, understanding what are the new forms of threats and risks that are emerging, and then also designing for those. So when we talk about privacy by design, security by design, it's exactly to take care of some of those concerns.
Great.
I have a lot to say on this. First of all, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but I have been working in this industry or related industries for over 30 years. And with the advent of the phone, there was a belief initially that there would be hundreds, not billions. Imagine your life today without a phone. And yes, there are risks, but think of all of the benefits and think of all of the things that we would not be able to do. And I believe the net of all of the risks is still an overall benefit for all of the things that it would enable. And we can just look at the pandemic. We were talking about that over a dinner last night. Could you have even gotten a vaccine or scheduled a vaccine if you weren't able to go online to know where to go and actually book it? So there are basic things that are so fundamental that would not be possible unless you are part of the ecosystem. There are risks, and we have to be careful of those risks. But ultimately, I think GDP is impacted when you have more people online, literacy, the ability to bring everybody along instead of those that can afford it. Overall, it is much better to have people and be aware of those risks and to deal with them as best as we can than to leave people off. Yeah.
It's way outweigh the risk, but it's good to hear that actively being.
Great.
I think the term is really proactive. I think, for too long we observed this as a sphere in which maybe other rules would apply, and I think this was a problem.
Yeah. So maybe the gentleman in the second row first, and then Pamela, we come to you.
My name is George Vredenberg. I'm chairman of the board of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. One branch of what we're going to do is to digitally, cognitively assess the world's population. So I'd love to talk to you about how, whether or not our work may join with your work to extend the digitalization to the solutions of the brain diseases. But I'm going to take a personal note here. I was at AOL. The first time I came to Davos was 20 years ago with Steve Case and AOL to try and persuade the world that the internet was a good thing. Before cell phones, before there was any of this, we coined the digital divide as a problem in the United States because it wasn't accessible. We had problems of child pornography, how to control that. We had problems of copyright violation, how to control that. How are we going to protect people who put their credit cards online because they didn't want to use and put credit cards online? Could you imagine never putting credit cards online today? So you've basically taken the debate that we had domestically 20 years ago to try and weigh values and downsides and taken it global. So I cannot say enough about how impressed I am by this alliance to try and take all of these problems and tackle them at a global level. I think the net benefit of the internet to the world has been extraordinary. It has been misused by governments, by cyber criminals, but nevertheless, the net balance has been terrific. And so I congratulate you on this alliance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would you mind passing it just there?
Pam Reeve from American Tower, and I'm so proud that we're a part of the Edison Alliance with our commitment to 2,000 digital communities by 2025. You asked why companies engage with this, and I just wanted to add to Rima's wonderful comments. We operate in many underdeveloped countries around the world or emerging economies around the world, and we want their economic development, and we want that development to be spread broadly. We need a skilled workforce and a healthy workforce in those environments. We want political stability in those environments. So it's good for our business. It's good for us to do it. But we also think it's a moral imperative. And as Hakim just said, life is impossible without access to the internet. What I wondered if some of you might address, and I'm looking at you, Paula, because I know you've done so much of this in Rwanda. For us to succeed in the 1 billion connectivity affected, not just connected, population by 2025, I think this is going to take an unprecedented level of partnership at all levels, from companies, quasis, nonprofits, and governments, probably the likes of which we've never seen before. More collaborative, more creative, dare I say, more innovative and flexible than we've seen before. And I wonder, since you've had so much success in Rwanda, if you might give the audience here an example of that we can see in the future. We know for our digital communities that's an absolute requirement.
Great, and I'm trying to think which would be the best example to use. But maybe just starting off by, it's one thing to have the financial resources, whether it's the money that is going to be, put together from private sector and governments, but it's another thing to think through the processes, the regulations that need to unlock this access, usage, and affordability. And I think that's where, and that's where the biggest pain point is in many times, is that many countries' regulations haven't caught up with the rate of innovation, with the rate at which technology is going. And the lack of that almost means that something that could take you a year or two to happen could take you another 10 years, because you're still stuck on very archaic regulations that are not relevant to the challenges that you're trying to solve for. And so even for us as governments, even as we launch the Lighthouse network of countries, it's really being able to allow ourselves to take the risk of breaking up some of these regulations and figuring out how is this going to happen. Just picking an example about and Derek knows because we worked very closely with the forum, we were trying to put in place our data protection and privacy law. We were one of a few African countries that have already put one in place. And just like many countries in the world, not just in Africa, a lot of them were benchmarking the GDPR. Now, is it convenient for our local context? Are there sticky issues globally that no one has sort of figured out? What do we do with that? And so things like hosting data in country, does that make sense? Does that help with, multinational companies? Because it would mean that every jurisdiction that you're in, you have to put a data center or some sort of facility because everyone wants to keep the data in country. What could be the alternatives? Could we think about, approaches like whitelisting? If I can pick 50 countries that have similar regulations at par with how we protect personal data usage, how can that be done? And so I would allow for many countries to be able to host my data. Can we think about data embassies? And so some of these things require that you really break the norm and try and figure out what makes sense for you to be able to be ahead. Because you can't leapfrog, you can't stay ahead of technology if you're still bogged down by regulations and policies that are not necessarily at par with where you are. And we've had our fair share of challenges, by the way. We've learned through many of these where we've put in place regulations and policies. They've worked for the first 2 to 5 years. After that, they just don't work. And so we've had to say, do we get stuck on a decision we made 5 years ago? Or do we just go ahead and figure out what makes sense? And so it's that agility that is required, because I feel many times that's what bogs down implementation and progress.
Great, thank you so much. We are running out of time here, so we're going to wrap up in 2 to 3 minutes. Perhaps I'll do one lightning round of maybe a tweet length thought to leave with the audience. I think we've heard about the 3 pillars that we're building across the Edison Alliance, with commitments, concrete commitments towards a defined target, a platform to enable the acceleration of shared learnings and the dissemination of successes, and then the focal points and lighthouse countries where we can actually bring the partnerships together. We've learned that we need to be confident that the benefits outweigh the risks, but we need to consciously manage those risks through the explicit acknowledgement of principles and the conscious incorporation of those into the design of regulations and policies. And I think, as you articulated very well, the combination of resources, partnerships, regulation, thinking through the processes of all of the things that are needed, but most important, staying agile. Now, I know I went longer than a tweet, but that was to give you guys the time to think of something. That was an email. That was a too long, didn't read email. But that was to give you time to come up with your tweet. So, Rima, I'm going to start with you.
Lots of different initiatives out there. The objective of the Alliance is really to look at how we can combine them to solve the problems that we are all looking at. We are all in this together, and I think we're all part of the solution. I don't think that was 140 characters, but it was not an email.
I believe Elon is looking at extending the length of tweets. Thank you.
So, abbreviation ICMYT, or in case you missed it, @web #Edison Alliance.
There you go. Very good.
I don't think
You
I
said
can
the
match
UNDP
that.
wasn't digital, right? It is to follow.
I don't think I can match that, but I'll give it a try. Well, exciting partnerships today, tackling digital inclusion at the core.
Excellent. Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.